This is I'm Pawel Bukowski. I'm from Center for Economic Performance at LSE. And this is a joint work with Steve Machin and David Soskis, also from London School of Economics. And I'm going to present you our new work, which tries to link globalization with rent sharing. And by rent sharing, I mean the extent to which companies are willing to share their profits with workers, which you can think of as a measure of workers' bargaining power. Now, I must mention this is the first time we are presenting this. This is still very preliminary and incomplete work. I also must acknowledge the financial support from Rebuilding Macroeconomics. But let me start with some motivation behind this project. So, since the 1970s and 80s, the global economy has experienced several profound changes. The most famous one are the growing income inequalities. So we have evidence for the falling labor share. The global labor share has declined from around 65% to 60%. We have also evidence for the growing decoupling between the productivity rise and the real wage rise. In particular, in many advanced economies, we see that real wages have been stagnating since the 80s and 90s. Then, of course, we have growing wage inequality and growing top income shares. The other big change was a new wave of globalization. So the share of export in total GDP has doubled since the 1960s. And we also see emergence of the global value chains, meaning that companies are increasingly using foreign inputs in their production. So here you can see the share of foreign value added in the total value of output goods. Okay, this is too small, I can see. Anyway, the point is that almost all industries in almost all countries are increasingly using more and more foreign value added in the production process. The third big change is a decline of workers' bargaining power. So what you can see on the left-hand side is the unionization ratio. So in the UK, more than 50% of workers at the end of the 70s were unionized. Today is less than a quarter. On the right-hand side, you can see the estimates of the rent sharing coming from my recent work with Brian Bell and Steve Machin, showing that companies are less and less likely to share their income, share their profits with workers. So we have these three big changes. On the one hand, growing inequalities. On the other hand, the new way of globalization. On the third hand, we have decline of the workers' bargaining power. And of course, people were trying to connect all these things together. In particular, there's a huge literature connecting the rise of the new wave of globalization with the growing inequalities. People point out to the role of manufacturing, reallocation to the role of trade-induced technology, and also trade-induced changes in relative price of inputs. Then there have been also a lot of work linking the decline of workers' bargaining power with growing inequalities. In particular, pointing that the decline of unions usually implies growing income inequality. And recently, we also have new work linking the growing firms' labor power over labor with the falling labor share. But so far, people tend to think about globalization and workers' bargaining power as almost two exogenous shocks affecting the global economy. Not people have actually thought about connecting these two things together to ask the question whether actually whether the fact that workers are losing their bargaining power could be actually a result of globalization. And this is the main research question behind this project. So we're trying to answer the question, how does the exposure to globalization affect workers' bargaining power and so their abilities to capture economic rents? And so this is basically a big empirical project which takes place which has two stages. The first, we have to somehow measure workers' bargaining power. And we do that using the concept of rent sharing. So rent sharing again means to what extent wages are determined by profits. So what happens with firm-level wages when firm-level profits go up? So what we do, we use the global firm-level data from Bureau van Dijk's Orbis, and we calculate the rent sharing, so the elasticity of wages with respect to profits, for all the industries and all the countries we can find in the data, since 2000. Next, having estimated these industry level measures of bargaining power, we then relate them with some other industry level measures of globalization. Okay? So this is, I think, very simple. First stage, we estimate global bargaining power. We don't have such existing estimates. Then we relate these estimates with some measures of globalization. So this is the big idea. What I'm going to show you today is a little bit more limited. So I'm going to show you estimates of rent sharing for 12 EU countries since 2000. I'm only going to focus on manufacturing industries. And then I'm going to relate these measures with the development of global value chains and with some measure of economic rent. Now, why do we care about all this stuff? Why do we care about connection between globalization and rent sharing? So I claim that this may inform us about how does wage setting process changes when companies develop international global value chains, which could possibly explain why do we observe real wage stagnation. It can also explain to us what happens when firms' market power rises and what are the implications for the local labor markets, which could also possibly explain why do we have such a growing special inequalities, in particular emergence of the so-called superstar cities, such as San Francisco, Chicago, London, and also the decline of other big cities such as Detroit. And finally, it can also shed light on the recent anti-globalization backlash. Why do people choose to support Brexit or trade wars, or why do they have anti-immigration values? If workers do not benefit from globalization, then why would they support such policies? I think this kind of may be a potential explanation of that. Okay, so this is the agenda. So I'm not going to now explain you what is rent sharing. I'm going to then connect this with globalization. Then I'm going to show you how do we estimate rent sharing in a very simple words. Then I'm going to try to connect this with globalization. So rent sharing, in technical words, is the elasticity of wages with respect to economic rents. Right? So what happens with wages when economic rents are growing? So if we take the textbook perfect competition model, Econ 101, there should be no rent sharing. First of all, there are no economic rents. Second thing, wages are given, so whatever happens inside the company should not have any effect on wages. But people did find evidence for positive rent sharing, so positive relationship between wages and profits. So usually they say that this is a sign that labor markets are not perfectly competitive. And the most usual explanation for this was saying that workers have certain bargaining power. So they engage in negotiations with company owners, and so they both agree how to split economic rents. So the portion of the economic rents, usually the majority of the portion, will go to the company owners in the form of profits, and the remaining part will go to the workers in the form of wages above the market level. Of course, it's not easy to capture economic rents in the data. So what people have usually done is they related wages with profits after accounting for the outside forces. And under the set of weak assumption, you can actually recover the original rent sharing parameter to the share of profits going to work, share of rents going to workers, by linking wages with profits. Now, why would globalization affect rent sharing? So I think the main mechanism is the development of global value chains. So think about old good days when companies were supplying most of its inputs from the local producers, right? So that when the company was doing well, it had a lot of profits. This was spilling over to the local economy because it was also supplying its inputs from the local producers. Now, from the workers' perspective, what it meant is that my company was doing well, and also all my outside options were growing because also the demand for local labor, the demand for labor was growing with the local labor markets, right? So my bargaining power was also growing. So I was seeing this increasing pie, this increasing economic rents, and also I saw that actually the outside option is also growing for me. So I could say, look, I'm going to go on strike, and my threat of strike is credible because my outside option is also high. But then also what would imply that the rent sharing should be higher in such environment. Now, companies develop international global value chains. What it means that this linkage between what happens with company profits and local economy is broken. Right? So the company can be very profitable, But workers may still face a relatively low outside option, relatively low labor market conditions. And so also, you're going to face weaker bargaining power, because now the threat of strike is much less credible, and so we should observe less rent sharing. Now, the second channel more directly relates to economic rents. So one can say that, okay, globalization leads to higher international competition, which lowers economic rents. And so the pie is getting smaller, and so are the incentives to actually capture a piece of the pie. Right? So workers have less incentives to invest in their bargaining power. It can also go the other way around. So you may see emergence of winner takes most markets with huge economic rents. So the pie is getting bigger, so workers' incentives to actually capture the slice of that pie. Now there's the final channel, which I'm not going to talk about today, which is simply saying that offshoring led to a profound changes in the occupational structure within companies. So we have less and less low-skilled workers, more and more high-skilled cognitive workers in advanced economies. And of course, when you employ more educated workers, that may have also implications for their bargaining power. Okay, so I'm going to now try to kind of test these first two hypotheses in a very preliminary way. But first, how do I actually measure rent sharing? So it's actually surprising that how little data on firms we have, which will be comparable across time and across countries. I think the only existing usable data at this stage is something which is called the Bureau van Dijk's Orbis. This is basically a huge bag to which Bureau van Dijk, which is a private company, threw all the data they could find about companies. This is a product which usually is sold to other companies to see what the market situation of the market. The problem with the data is it's not a scientific database. So it has the size of the sample is changing for time. You have suddenly sample grows by 10,000 observations for some reason. So it's actually very hard to take this data and use it instantly. So actually, it takes a lot of time to clean this data and to make it usable for scientific purpose in order to have a sample which is comparable and consistent across time. So in total, we have more than 300 million companies across the world in the database. But now what I had to do actually, I had to limit the data only to the one which is usable, and I ended up with the list of 12 EU countries since 2000. What's lucky for me is that actually I have countries which are covering more or less all the regions in the European Union. So I have Southern Europe, I have Western Europe, I have Eastern Europe, and I have Scandinavia. I think that's still good coverage. The only exception is Germany, which actually has a quite bad data quality in Orbis, but I still decided to keep it because it's such an important country. Now, I'm only looking at companies larger than 20 employees to kind of limit the potential measurement error. And I also, one thing to remember here is that data in Orbis comes from the financial reports. So they refer to the global company operations. So when I think about the British company, let's say I'm talking about Tesco, when I see profits of Tesco and the payroll of Tesco, I'm referring to the global operation of Tesco, not just the British activity, right? Because actually it's not obvious if we calculate the average wage for British companies that will actually should correspond to the average wage from national accounts. So these two should be different because we are talking about different operations. But still, I mean, I had to somehow say something about how good is the data. So I compared Orbis with other existing databases, in particular EU claims, which give us quite good estimates of the industry level wages and profits. And I'm going to go very quickly through this. Let me show that for most of the countries, actually, I quite get a pretty good match. So this is Belgium. This is Czech Republic. These are the average wages. The black line is Orbis. The dashed line is the external data coming from national accounts. Here we have profits, and actually it does look pretty good. I was actually quite surprised how well this data is tracked. But again, this is, I cherry pick the countries, the ones which actually work. If you look at Portugal, it's a mess, for instance. And okay, so just keep that. Okay, so just, I know you should get the red card now. But it's very simple. How do I estimate rent sharing? It's simple or less. I regress wages at the company level, on company level profits. Then I control for the bunch of staff. I put firm fixed effect, right? So I'm looking at the effect of changing profits on changing wages. And then I control for this kind of all the industry level year fixed effects, which are kind of capturing to me the outside forces. So the thing which I'm really interested in is beta, right? So what's the effect of a rise of profits on wages? And I did it separately for 2 periods, before the Great Recession, so 2000, 2008, and after the Great Recession, after 2009. So I'm comparing these 2 periods. Okay, so I would do it at the industry level. So I'm going to get beta for each and every industry, each and every country. But here let me just show you, zoom out into the country level estimate. So here are the estimates of rent sharing for my countries. This is rent sharing before the recession. This is rent sharing after the recession. This is for companies more than 20 employees, for a little bit higher, larger companies. Now, what does it mean? 0.01, for instance. It means that 1% increase in profits leads to 0.01% increase in wages. So you may think this is a very tiny number, 1%, 0.01%. But you must remember that profits can be extremely volatile and change a lot from year to year. So even such a small coefficient actually can have important implications for the wages and for the wages gap. But anyway, so what we can see is that for almost all of the countries in my sample, we see the decline of rent sharing. Right? So this is so whenever the dot is below the 45-degree line, it means that the rent sharing has fallen when we compare the period before recession to the after the recession. Okay? Now actually this is the experimental idea. I just show other countries I could find in Orbis. And you can actually see that you see basically the same pattern once we also put the data with more shakier data, countries with more shakier data. Now, if you look at industry by industry, only manufacturing. So here we have rent sharing for these 2 periods, and here we have, let's say, food products in different countries. And you can see that for most of the industries, you can actually see also evidence for the decline of rent sharing. The only exception are the chemicals, where you kind of see 50-50. In some countries, the rent sharing has increased, the other one, it declined. The other exception is electrical and optical equipment, where actually, in most of the countries, worker bargaining power has rised. But to wrap up this part, so basically I'm showing, I think, quite a strong evidence for the fall of workers' bargaining power across the EU countries. There's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of levels and changes, which I think it would be interesting by itself to explore. I also show that it's kind of, you see the same thing in each and every industry. And I'm not showing this to you, but actually I also look at other sectors, like services. And you'll see actually very similar patterns, except a few ones. I think the only exception are the IT services, IT industry, where you usually see growing workers' bargaining power. So now we have this evidence for the falling rent sharing. Now the question is whether we can link it somehow with the new wave globalization. And the first channel I explore are the emergence of the global value chains. And again, the argument is as follows. In a place where we have a big share of value added coming from the foreign inputs, we're going to have weak domestic linkages between what happens inside the company and the local, both local economy and local labor markets, right? So whenever the company is doing well, the workers are going to still face weak outside option, but you're going to lower their bargaining power, going to lower rent sharing. Okay, so that's the basic logic. Now, how do I measure this linkage between the company profits and the local economies? I'm using the word input-output database, and I measure the share of domestic value added in the final value of the value chain. Right? So if I am selling you a car, and I'm selling a car in Britain, what fraction of the value of that car comes from the inputs supplied by the domestic producers, right? So it's kind of inverse of global value chains, right? So when this share is high, it means that I have strong connection. There's a strong connection between company and local economy, meaning that there's a connection between company profits and the workers' outside option, meaning that workers have high bargaining power. When the share is low, we see the opposite. Now what I do, I take those estimates of rent sharing, which I just showed you a few minutes before, and I regress them on the measure of the share of domestic value added. I expect this to be positive, right? More domestic value added, stronger linkages between the company and local labor market. Then I control for the industry fixed effects, here fixed effects, and specific trends, and so on. For this story to make sense, first I have to show you that the falling rent sharing is accompanied by the falling share of domestic value added in the final output. And this is indeed the case. So this is the data for my countries. You can see there's a lot of heterogeneity here, which is, I think, interesting by itself. But on average, the share of domestic value added has fallen from around 40.5% to 39% in that period. Now, these are the simple correlations. Now, if I simply correlate rent sharing at the industry level with the share of domestic value added at the industry level, I get no correlation. But now, once I add industry fixed effects, I'm looking at changes. So I'm comparing change in rent sharing to change in the domestic value added share. I get a strong and positive coefficient, which later on weakens once I keep adding more fixed effects. And at the end, I reach these coefficients here, which are, I would say, relatively strong, and they are positive. They are not significant, but only marginal. The p-value is 11%. So I would say this is a suggestive evidence of quite a good, strong connection between the share of domestic value added and workers' bargaining power. Okay? And just side note, so of course the problem here is that when I put rent sharing elasticity on the left-hand side of the equation, it's already estimates coming from different equation. And I'm correcting this by using a method by Saxon House from 1974. But it doesn't matter anyway. Now the next channel are economic rents. And I must say this is still a very indirect evidence. So basically, again, the argument will be that international competition leads to lower economic rents. So the pie is shrinking, and so the workers' incentives to actually capture a slice of that pie. And that should lower rent sharing. How do I measure rents? So basically, I should capture economic rents coming from globalization. I don't know how to do it at this stage, I must admit. This will be the next step in my research. What I'm doing now, I'm simply taking economic rents defined at the average profit margin of companies, which is basically profits divided by revenue. And so I do exactly the same thing. I regress rent sharing elasticities from the previous stage on the measure of profit margin. And again, I should find positive coefficient, right? So the more profit margins I have, the more rents I have, the bigger the pie, the more likely workers are going to fight for the size of that pie. Okay? And again, for this story to make sense, I must show you that profit margins have been declining across in the industrial sector. So this is the data from Orbis. These are the profit margins before the recession. These are the profit margins after the recession. Each dot is an industry by country, right? So, and we see that, it's maybe hard to see from this what's happening. Some industries we see rise of profit margins, but on average, actually, the profit margins has declined from 3.1% to 2.7%. Now, the same table, but here actually we see across all specifications we have evidence for positive and significant correlation between the profit margin economic rents and rent sharing elasticity. So to wrap up this, first of all, I show there's a positive correlation between the share of domestic value added and workers' bargaining power. Now, if this is causal, I still cannot claim causality here. That would imply that the falling share of domestic value added coming from the development of international global value chains would explain why workers are losing their bargaining power. The next evidence is that there's actually a positive connection between rent sharing and economic rents. And again, if causal, the falling profit margins due to higher international competition would explain why workers are also losing their bargaining power. Okay? Conclude, I show the falling labor share, falling rent sharing, and I link this with globalization. It is still very preliminary. The next stages of this research would be to actually get more direct measures of trade involvement. So see what's the value of export for a given industry. Expand this to non-EU countries. Try to look at sectors outside manufacturing. And finally, last but not least, to actually try to find causal relationships here, right? So I'm not only showing you correlations, which are quite suggestive, but Ideally, I would like to have some IV for the exposure to globalization, for instance, China shop. Thank you.